service people in the area to give them some information, and therefore this blackout is almost a balancing act that they have to keep going.
Yes, I mean, that is true, but I think the prime function is, as Paul says, is to keep the information to a minimum. Don't forget, the Iraqis have got no air power, so therefore they can't fly over and have a look where say, tanks are. They know roughly where they started from, but they don't know what sort of numbers. They've probably got very degraded communication, so they're not even talking to each other very well.
Which could explain why they're not having these Scud salvos that you were mentioning.
It could explain that, but I think that would be a central command. That would be a higher command decision anyway. And so, I mean, to tell them anything at this stage, when the great advantage, apart from air power, is its surprise, and you started the war, i.e. the coalition started the war, when the coalition wanted to start the war. So certainly for 48 hours, maybe even 72 hours, they can keep this thing up and keep the surprise and move wherever they like in the battlefield.
OK, Chris Lee, Paul Reynolds, for now, thank you very much. It's just coming up to 7 o'clock here on Radio 4 News FM. Time for a bulletin of the latest news from John Hedges.
He wants Saddam Hussein and his regime to be taken off the face of earth, wiped up completely.
If the Allies go and eliminate or push Iraq out of Kuwait and Saddam Hussein stays in power, in other words, Saddam Hussein is not kicked out as he wants, will he feel safe?
إذا القوات طردت العراقيين من الكويت لكن استمر صدام في الحكم هل حتشعر بالأمان؟
والله لابد ينزاح هذا مهما كان.
He must be ousted no matter what.
We show him how we are strong and we show him how much we can do for him, and I hope he will just have the lesson being given to him very clear now. We will not tolerate any way of his attacking any of our states. Whatever, I mean, talking about Gulf state or neighborhood anyway.
Are you absolutely confident that the Allies will win?
Oh, yeah. Oh, no. Not doubt. This is a crazy, mad guy. I don't know how he think about it. Oh, yeah. No doubt.
Do you think this war will last a long time now?
No, I think he'll be dead. He'll be finished.
Do you think there was another way of getting him out of Kuwait? A different way except this war, or only the war?
I think there is now no way, because before 6 months they try to stop the war and there is no method to stop it. I think by force we'll get it.
Barnaby Mason in Riyadh talking to some shoppers there in the Saudi capital. Chris Lee, there's some stuff coming in on the news agencies about what President Mitterrand has been saying.
Yes, I mean, earlier today there were reports that coming from Kuwaiti sources suggesting that Allied troops had gone into Kuwait. President Mitterrand has been on television today, and he's confirmed that the French have indeed got 30 miles or so into Iraq. But on this question of whether the Allied troops are in fact there in Kuwait City, he's saying, if there were Allied troops in Kuwait City, we would know it. Now, the inference is not so much that the French would also be there, but is the fact that it's such an important objective that he, as a president, would have been informed by now.
It certainly seems to do the opposite of confirm what the Kuwaiti ambassador in Paris was saying earlier today, which was that Kuwait City was virtually in the hands of the Allies, which is something which, by all accounts, we ought to discount for now.
Yes, but I think we have to also accept that it's quite possible that the forces are quite close to Kuwait.
The message coming out of the War Cabinet is that progress so far has been going as planned, if not a little better. It's a cautious message, so far so good, but they're telling us and through us, the public, don't be excessively optimistic. It's very early days yet. If I can just fill you in on what John Major has been doing before the War Cabinet. At about 20 to 10, he had a conversation on the telephone with Mr. Kohl, the German leader. Now, the Prime Minister briefed him on the military developments. They also discussed the atrocities that reports are coming in from Kuwait City. Both expressed horror at what they said sounded very gruesome reports, but they both agreed there was a need for more independent corroboration, for verification of these reports before it could be absolutely clear what was going on. Now, they also compared notes on the Soviet attitude to the developments after the failure of the Soviet six-point peace plan, and both agreed that the Soviet Union apparently seems anxious to keep good relations with the West and not to let the war and the failure of that plan to worsen those. So that's something both were stressing. Now, the War Cabinet itself, which happened at 10 o'clock and lasted just over an hour, was virtually all taken up with a detailed briefing by Sir David Craig, the Chief of the Defence Staff, on the military operations in the Gulf since the land offensive began. Now, obviously, for reasons of security, they're not giving us much idea of what went on there. We can't get any information on the level of casualties beyond what we already know. But generally, the stress has been that these are early days, and there's anxiousness to stress the analogy of the euphoria that was widespread after the first days of the air campaign. Now, we're being told that we must realise there are still significant forces that haven't been engaged, and so there mustn't be excessive optimism. On the POW front, the word from Downing Street again is slightly more cautious than other reports. We're being told that well over 10,000 POWs have been taken.
I think we had a figure of 14,000, I think,
right.
earlier. Yeah.
I think the two are consistent. Downing Street is being slightly more cautious, and we're being told that these are causing some logistical problems in getting this large number of POWs back through the lines. The Allies are well equipped to cope with the POWs when they can get them back to the camps that have been set up, or the facilities to look after them, but it's getting them back through the lines that maybe is tying up some forces a little bit. One interesting thing, it was largely a reporting session, as I say, with Sir David Craig, briefing with intelligence information, the War Cabinet, and we're being told that a lot will be learned from this campaign, although there's no information on what those lessons seem to be at the moment. Now, later on, Tom King, the Defence Secretary, will be making a statement to the Commons. After that, there will be a Ministry of Defence press news conference, and we understand also, which you may well know, that there'll be a briefing in Riyadh at 3 o'clock. So generally, the mood of the War Cabinet was interested. They were listening to the plans that had been laid over many months and how those had gone into operation, what the result had been. We were asking about the Republican Guard, the reports that the Republican Guard were now moving possibly towards engaging the Allied forces. The War Cabinet was certainly given an update on where those Iraqi forces are, but they're not telling us anything. John Major, the Prime Minister himself, is unlikely to speak today, apart from the keeping in touch with the Gulf. He's fulfilling his normal duties. He's met a leading Italian politician. He's had his normal weekly meetings about the week ahead and with his business managers. Now, the news blackout then is not going to be total, as I've said. There are going to be briefings this afternoon. There's going to be a statement in the Commons, which will doubtless not give much operational information, but it may be able to give us a picture on the Allied casualties, on the British casualties, if any, and reassure MPs. And also there'll be the option then, the possibility for MPs to make the calls they'll be doubtless wanting. Many Tories will be asking for reparations and for us to make sure that Saddam Hussein is removed. A lot of Labour MPs will be stressing that's not a war aim. That's generally the picture then. Not a lot of information coming out of the War Cabinet itself, but quiet confidence, but a stress on cautious optimism. It's very early days.
Reparations, where's the money going to come from? Iraq's broke?
Well, that's certainly the case, but there is a feeling that whatever Iraq's financial position at the moment, there is a very strong case for some sort of financial reparations, and also a feeling from many Tory MPs that there should be some kind of retribution, some kind of war trials. Now, we've been through all this before. It's very hard to see how either of those would come about without moving deep into Iraq to actually get a lot of the Iraqi leadership who would be wanting to be held to account in war trials. As far as reparations go, then as you say, Iraq is, as a country is broke. It has enormous international debts, but there is a feeling that the kind of atrocities that have been perpetrated can't go unpunished.
What about the conversation with Chancellor Cole?
Well, what about it, John?
You were saying that Mr. Major and Chancellor Cole had a conversation earlier.
That's right. Well, as I went through what they said, the Allied leaders have agreed to keep in touch generally. I mean,
yeah, I just wondered what the attitude, if there was any way of assessing what the attitude in Germany. I mean, we know that there was a lot of anti-war sentiment being expressed in Germany. One wonders whether any of that. Whether that is changing now that the land offensive seems to be succeeding?
Well, from what we understand, and Chancellor Cole has been expressing total solidarity with what has been done at this stage. Now, obviously, there have been concerns in Germany, but for the moment, both sides have been expressing satisfaction at the way the land campaign is going and at the necessity for that land campaign. As I said, there were discussions on the Soviet attitude, and both countries, and no doubt especially the Germans, will be most concerned that relations with the Soviets should not be jeopardized in what has been a very difficult patch, when there was a strong feeling that the Soviet efforts to get a peace plan could be undermining in some sense the Allied efforts, and perhaps leading to a solution that would, for many in the Allied forces and for many in the Allied camp, and especially the Americans, would have been seen as a nightmare scenario of Saddam Hussein retreating with his war machine intact. But the message we're getting is clearly that Chancellor Cole and his coalition is on side, and that's how things are going to stay. And both countries are going to keep in touch. Mr. Major has agreed with the other Allied leaders, with President Mitterrand, with Mr. Signor Andreotti, with Mr. Bolger of New Zealand and Chancellor Cole, that they'll keep in regular contact. They're going to have conversations every 2 or 3 days on the phone, and everything is being done to keep the Allies together and to make sure that everyone is well briefed on what's going on.
Rob Orchard in Downing Street, thanks very much indeed. Chris Lee, logistical problems with all these prisoners of war, 14,000 of them, it must be difficult.
Yes, I mean, it's not difficult handling prisoners of war, because if you remember, Britain, for example, sent out three battalions of infantry. Now, a battalion, say, the sort of people they'd send, about 500 men, bit short of a battalion. So it was 1,500 men to look after the prisoners. And they expected somewhere in the region of 15,000 for the British to look after. The Americans were saying before the war started, the ground offensive started, that they had made preparations to look after about 20,000. So it's not that the numbers aren't the problem. The big problem is the speed at which prisoners are giving themselves up. Because if you're an advancing army or an advancing division, you really aren't necessarily geared to look after prisoners. Now, you have people that are coming along with you whose job it is to look after prisoners. In fact, some of them yesterday, were going back from Kuwait, where they'd been captured by bus. I mean, they weren't actually sort of standing waiting for a bus to turn up, but they had...
A wonderful image that you conjure there, Chris.
But they had actually sent buses up, because what else could they do? Because they need all the military transport, they'd sent buses up to get the prisoners, take them back to the Saudi lines, and debrief them, do all the things they have to do about registering them, etc., and then put them into the camps. Now, but the important thing is, if you get too many at once, it's not the numbers you get, it's when you get them. If you get too many at once, they become very difficult to handle. And also, you will see more and more pictures, I'm sure, of just lines of them trudging back, because that's the easiest way to handle them. I mean, you disarm them. They're not about to start their own war, private war. They're probably, a lot of them are pleased to be out of the war.
Getting a decent meal.
Well, whether they get a decent meal or not, but it is pleased to be out of the whole conflict. But it does necessarily provide another difficulty for a very rapidly advancing army, an army which is putting a lot of its success down to the fact that, A, it prepared the battlefield, but it is very fast, it is mobile, and it's advancing quickly, and prisoners of war mustn't get in the way of that advance if it's to be successful.
And there will be many more of them yet, presumably. Chris Lee, for the moment, thank you very much. This is Radio 4 News FM. We're approaching 12 o'clock.
BBC News at noon. There has been an explosion on a railway line in Hertfordshire this morning. It happened near St Albans at about 6:30. No one was hurt. Gary Eason has this report.
Hertfordshire police say the explosion happened shortly before 6:30 this morning on the Bedford to St Pancras line in the suburbs of St Albans, about a mile south of the town centre. A spokesman said the blast damaged an overhead power cable and sent a 2-foot length of rail track weighing 30 to 40 pounds flying 100 metres through the air. It hit the garage of a house, causing some damage, but no one was hurt. Members of Scotland Yard's anti-terrorist branch have been to the scene, and the police spokesman said the implication was that the explosion was caused by what he called a device of some sort.
British Rail says many of the mainline stations in London have now reopened after the security alert earlier this morning. Those still closed are London Bridge, Charing Cross, St Pancras, Moorgate and Waterloo East. An Iraqi silkworm missile has been intercepted and destroyed by an Allied Sea Dart fired from the British warship HMS Gloucester. There were no casualties and the ships were undamaged. The Gloucester was protecting the American battleship Missouri, which was bombarding Iraqi positions. Michael Nicholson reports on the attack.
In what could be a final desperate attempt to sink a British warship, the Iraqis fired a silkworm missile at this destroyer early this morning. The radar-guided missile, which weighed 3 tons, that's 3 times bigger than an Exocet, was launched from the coast just over our horizon a little before daybreak. Gloucester was at that moment acting as shotgun to the U.S. battleship Missouri, that is, protecting it from air and missile attack, while the American warship's 16-inch guns continued to bombard remaining Iraqi installations off Kuwait City. Within 7 seconds of sighting the silkworm on Gloucester's radar, 2 Sea Dart missiles were fired, and they intercepted it when the silkworm was less than 30 seconds away. The explosion was clearly seen by those on deck.
The latest military communique from Baghdad claims Iraqi forces have recaptured all positions taken by the Allies at the start of the war. Tim Llewellyn, who is working under Iraqi restrictions, reports from Baghdad.
The Iraqi military communique said there had been fighting of legendary proportions, lasting 8 hours, with the Iraqi army repelling an Allied armoured attack, fighting off an airborne landing inside Iraqi lines, killing men and destroying equipment, and actually launching a counter-offensive. The Iraqis said the Third Army, which is known to be in Kuwait itself, and is one of Iraq's most experienced and best-trained units, had engaged the enemy, the Allies in our parlance, for 8 hours. It had expelled all Allied forces from territory they had occupied, the Iraqis said. Allied troops had been seen running away, leaving behind burning vehicles and equipment, fleeing in disgrace, as the Iraqis put it.
There's been a sharp worsening in Britain's balance of trade with the rest of the world. New figures from the government say the gap between exports and imports in January widened to £1.2 billion, an increase of £350 million on the previous month. The figure is the worst monthly trade deficit since July. Here's our economics editor, Dominic Harrod.
Exports fell by £100 million and imports rose by more than twice that amount to produce this sharp worsening in the figures. However, the Treasury commented immediately after the figures that the underlying trend still shows an improvement. Over 3 months, exports are still 2% higher than a year ago, while imports are still being squeezed, 2% down over the past 3 months and 6% lower than a year ago. In the markets, the figures were taken calmly, with share prices virtually unmoved after the strong rise earlier in the day. At one point, the 100 share index was up 30 points, partly because of favourable reports from the Gulf, and partly on hopes that good trade figures might allow a further cut in interest rates today, a hope now dashed by the surprisingly poor result.
The case against the 6 men jailed for the Birmingham pub bombings in 1974 was further weakened this morning when the Director of Public Prosecutions announced that he would no longer argue that their convictions were safe and satisfactory. The announcement came during a preliminary hearing at the High Court in London, ahead of the full appeal, which is due to begin next Monday. The Crown's lawyer said he could no longer rely on police evidence in the case. The Crown has already decided that forensic evidence given in the case is no longer reliable. BBC Radio News.
This is Radio 4 FM. You and Yours is just starting on Longwave, presented by John Waite, and that's followed at 12:25 by the last of Robert Cushman's series on Stan Freberg, It Only Hurts When I Laugh. We, meanwhile, continue with Radio 4 News FM, for which we rejoin John Humphreys.
Hello again, and let's start this session by following up the report on the trade balance. As you may have heard there, it worsened sharply last month. The gap between exports and imports didn't narrow, as lots of people had thought it would. It widened to £1.2 billion. That compares with 850 who have captured 1,800 Iraqi troops. Our correspondent Stephen Jessel is on the line now from Paris. Good morning, Stephen.
Good morning, John.
Oh, I think it's good afternoon. It's good afternoon with you, certainly, isn't it? It's 1:15 with you, 12:15 with us. What else are they saying?
Well, this is an update, really. Last night it was announced that the French troops who've been at the spearhead of the thrust into Iraq had captured some 1,000 Iraqi troops. This morning, military sources here are talking about a total of 1,800. So that's an extra 800 who've been captured during the last few hours. It all seems to be going, the French end anyway, very well. They released a few details about some of the prisoners they've captured. It's said that these prisoners are delighted to have been captured by the French. Whether they're delighted to have been captured in the first place or whether it was the fact that the French who took them that so pleases them isn't clear. It also appears that the senior officers removed from these prisoners or from these troops their personal radios, that is to say anything they could listen to foreign radio stations on in the days before the thrust into Iraq. Also, the French are claiming to have captured quite a lot of material, mostly tanks, T-54s and T-55s. These are rather elderly tanks, and of course it confirms that the troops that the Allies are meeting at the moment are far from being the cream of Iraqi forces.
Are you getting more information generally? Presumably the news blackout, as was, applied to Paris, French sources as much as to any other?
Yes, we're not getting very much here. Last night there was, there did seem to be a certain crack in the silence, and the French were giving rather more details. For example, they specified how far they'd got in the opening phase of this operation. They'd got some 50 kilometres into Iraq, and there have been reports from French journalists, French reporters with the troops. They're not giving very much away. We do know that there are some 13,000 troops involved in the French operation, of which 9,000 are French, and another 4,000 Americans who appear to be under French control, French command for this particular operation.
What about the Foreign Legion?
Yes, they're part of them. There are something like 2,600 Foreign Legionnaires who make up part of the 12,000 French troops who are in Saudi Arabia, most of whom are now in Iraq, of course, given these figures, and they form about a quarter of them.
Are they seen in France as the sort of dashing figures we see them as, the French Foreign Legion?
Dashing is not, I'm not sure is the word I'd have used. They are very, very formidable troops indeed. I think the French regard them with a certain amount of awe. Of course, it's something of a fiction that they are a foreign legion. Something like half of the troops in the legion are, in fact, just as French as anybody else in France. But there is a fiction that you say that you're a Belgian or a Canadian, and nobody inquires too much as to whether this is really true or not.
Because the assumption was that if you wanted to get away from it all for various reasons, you had a slightly murky past, then you might join up with the French Foreign Legion, as you say, no questions asked, and so it was full of, well, I use the word dashing, as you say, probably completely wrongly. Lots of them were shady gentlemen.
Well, I think there's a presupposition that you join the Foreign Legion because you don't want too many questions asked about your past, and it may not be terribly convenient to live in your own particular country. I know a bit about the Legion. It is not, in fact, a gang of cutthroats. You can't have these days a modern army entirely staffed by murderers and footpads. They have to have a certain degree of skill to operate modern weaponry. But they are investigated. Some sort of check is run on them. If they're wanted for bouncing checks or relatively minor crime, then the authorities turn a blind eye. I think if somebody was wanted for murder and they tried to join the Foreign Legion, they would probably be told to go away.
What about the attitude to the war in France generally now? It was cool at the very start of it all, to say the least. Under Mr. Chevènement, there were very serious questions being asked. Has all that gone away now?
That has gone away to an extraordinary degree. In fact, the latest poll that came out this morning shows a thumping majority in favour of what the Allies are doing. Huge plus approval ratings for Mr. Mitterrand, slightly less for Mr. Bush, but still very, very strong majorities in favour of what is going on. All those doubts to which you referred before the war, when it did appear that public opinion was very much against any military engagement, all those have been swept away, and the French are completely solid. That said, that after the war, Mr. Mitterrand last night made it clear that France was going to go its own way again, was going to have its own views on what form the settlement after the war should take. But for the moment, the French are about as solid as they could be.
But the cynics were saying in the early days that the French are lukewarm about it all because they want to retain their special relationship with Iraq, and in a post-war Middle East they'll want to retain all the privileges that they had. Is that being given up now then, or have they? Is it a bit more pragmatic and they've decided that Saddam Hussein's finished anyway, the old Iraq is finished anyway, and what the heck?
Well, I think it's a combination of all of them. This war has been a real jolt to the French because it's disposed of quite a lot of ideas they had, of fantasies, to be honest with you, to some extent. They had nurtured the myth that they had a special relationship with the Arab world, that their troops, that they were able to do all sorts of things at the military level, and they've had real difficulties in assembling the troops and the forces that they do have in the Gulf, and they had to look again at the whole question of how they defend themselves. I think President Mitterrand early on took the view that it was going to be necessary to come to this land offensive and to military action, and everything he's done since then has been going in that direction. He's also taken an extraordinary care to take French public opinion along with him. His television appearance last night was the 12th time he'd been on television to speak to the French nation since August the 2nd, and he's been very careful to build a consensus and to maintain a consensus, and as the opinion poll I was just mentioning shows, he seems to have been very successful in doing so.
But what happened to all those French chauvinists who hate the idea of having French troops answerable to the Americans and so on?
Well, they're lying low at the moment. I think even those people who have reservations about the way this war is being conducted, and specifically about the way that some people think that the French have subordinated their own interests to those of the United States, those people are not saying that at the moment. French citizens, French people are in the Gulf. They're in immense danger. They're fighting. They may sooner or later run up against the Republican Guard, and then things could get very bloody indeed. And this is not really the time, I think, it's felt here, to be making political points about whether you command Americans or are commanded by Americans. And that...
I would counsel a committee against supposing that the war is going to be over very quickly. I'm trespassing on what the Secretary of State for Defence will say, but I think when the House listens to him this afternoon, they will find that some kind of warning against any such assumption. The truth, surely, about power in a country like Iraq is that, it abhors a vacuum. I mean, there will be somebody in charge. It may not be in complete charge, but there will be somebody. And but the difficulty of answering hypothetical questions is that we don't know who that somebody will be or what line they will be taking. And really the immediate post-war decisions which will fall to the Allied military and the Allied governments will depend on answers to those questions which we don't have. Of course, we look at the various possibilities. And of course we begin to establish in our own minds how we would respond to them. But I think the committee will understand why I really do not want to be drawn further onto that ground this morning.
That was the Foreign Secretary, Douglas Hurd, talking before the Foreign Affairs Select Committee earlier this morning. Paul Reynolds, I don't suppose you'll have been surprised that he didn't want to commit himself on what happens after Saddam Hussein?
I think the problem there, John, is what happens unless Saddam Hussein is removed. That's why he's very reluctant to talk, because this is the great question. How are you going to get rid of Saddam Hussein?
Look, having asked you a question, I'm now going to stop. I do apologise. It's just that Mark Leahy has come up. He's only got a minute to talk to us. Mark Leahy, have you got something to tell us? I should say he's come up from Saudi Arabia, of course, our defence correspondent. Mark?
Well, there's nothing overly specific about it, but the information we're getting is still very much that there is that the advance is continuing well. There's been some sort of updates on some of the information. I think earlier we were talking about Republican Guard tanks being quite close to the Saudi-Kuwait border. I think that they may well actually be much further north than that. These are quite confused reports. So while there do appear to be Republican Guard tanks out and about, which is a definite change in the situation, they've been bunkered down for so long, I don't know that they're in an immediately dangerous position for coalition forces. I suspect they're still well to the north.
You've not been hearing anything about the Iraqi claims. There was a communique from Baghdad this morning saying its 3rd Army Corps had recaptured its frontline position in a counter-offensive against Allied troops, driven back the Allies forced to leave behind burned-out tanks and other military vehicles.
Well, I haven't seen any signs of incipient panic amongst the American military here, so I guess they might doubt those reports. I'm trying to locate where the 3rd Corps is. I suspect it's one of the corps. I think it's one of the corps in southern Kuwait and along the coastal area. In which case, as I understand it, one of the divisions it claims to have defeated is probably at least 80 miles away. So, it's a very difficult one to decipher. I don't doubt that the fighting is beginning to intensify, but one has to throw some doubt on these reports.
Exactly. Paul Reynolds has something to say on that. Yeah.
Good morning, Mark.
Hello there.
The 3rd Army Corps, according to intelligence briefers in London, took part in the attack on Kafji. So it does appear to be in southern Kuwait. The question I was going to ask you was not so much what's going on in Kuwait, but what you can tell us about this thrust into Iraq, because all the reports we're now getting in here, all reports which have been cleared by the various military censors, French reports, American reports, about a big thrust up into Iraq to encircle and engage the Republican Guard, and people have been talking about the French Daguet Division, the 101st US Airborne Division with this huge helicopter lift to something called Cobra Base 50 miles inside Iraq, and the 7th Corps with the British Armoured Division heading, trundling up like a steamroller to engage the Republican Guard. I mean, this, from all the reports we're getting now from these cleared reports from the military censors, how do you assess all that, what's going on west of Kuwait?
Well, I think this is the war-winning thrust. This is the main axis of the Allied advance. I think what we had was the French went first because they're light and very mobile and seem to have been in support of the 101st Airborne, who have been put deep into Iraq to cut supply lines and also possibly prevent the retreat. I think they're a long way in. I've seen something that suggests that how far in they are, and I won't say that, but it's a long way. And the French have been moving very fast indeed. I think they've also got another division of the US 18 Corps, which is a very mobile division with the 24th Mechanized. And then just to their right is the US 7th Corps, as you said, and that's going very fast north. Now, they've got options. They're going to meet the Republican Guard one way or another because the Republican Guard, as you say, are to the sort of top left of Kuwait, but in Iraq itself. They could encircle them, or they could meet them head on. I would guess that they'll encircle them, though I have no information to that. And they then start getting towards places like Nasiriyah, Basra, which are all up to the north of Kuwait. These are the main areas to get towards Baghdad, so you could be seeing a massive outflanking movement to cut off the Kuwaiti theatre of operations and encircle and destroy the main Iraqi forces. I mean, I think this is a very ambitious thing, and as you say, there's enough now being cleared by the military that we can talk that this is a reasonable option which they must have in mind.
Yes.
There would be a political problem of going into Basra and Nasiriyah, of course, but would they need do that to accomplish the task of encircling and defeating the Republican Guard? Could they cut the road or the river lines, which these reports have been talking about?
I think Nasiriyah, they certainly don't need to go into Nasiriyah at all. I mean, it's a question of cutting lines of retreat rather than taking territory. I think it's an important point you raised there, that if they go there, there's no overwhelming military reason that they have to start taking cities. Neither would they want to start fighting through them. I mean, they are in here to try and reduce casualties, not increase them. So I think they'll be looking at them as points on a map rather than cities they want to occupy. The idea is to defeat forces, not take territory. And
13 men.
It was a routine mission, twice daily, keeping a watch over Allied shipping in the northern Gulf, very near the shores of Kuwait. Routine, that is, until an unidentified fighter locked onto the Nimrod's tail. Sergeant Rick Williams and Sergeant Chris Spencer were manning the radar at the time.
You all right? Okay? I'm hanging on.
What's happening anyway?
Well, basically we had a bogey which is a hostile aircraft. The reports are it came from the Kuwaiti side and came out to where we were operating. Obviously we took evasive action, and last updated report from the surface ship was that he was heading east. At the moment, there's no threat at the moment.
There's no threat?
Not at the moment, no. It would appear that he's gone off eastwards.
You don't know which plane?
No idea what sort of plane. When they say it's a bogey, the people who were talking to the friendly ships and what have you who held him, they're saying he's a hostile aircraft and he came from Kuwait.
So where is he now?
Well, he's gone off east. That's about as much as I can tell you. Can't say anymore.
So what are you going to do now?
Well, just maintain a soft posture and just hold back and okay, we can downgrade it. It was reassessed as a friendly aircraft.
Did it shake you up a bit, that?
Yeah, it certainly did. The annoying thing was we couldn't find him with the radar. Usually, radar's very good for picking up airborne contacts. We usually get them up to 100 miles away. Within 50 miles, you can see exactly how high they are, where they're going. And this time, we were being given ranges and bearings, which should have helped us out even more than usual. But we still couldn't find him, which is always quite worrying. So basically, we had a hostile aircraft. We had no bearing on him. We didn't know where he was and which direction he was going. It was all third-party information, which doesn't give you a great deal of confidence. But luckily, the radar guys looking out for us found out exactly what he was and where he was going. So quite good.
So you're okay now?
Yeah.
I hope.
Relieved.
That crisis lasted a long 10 minutes. On the way home, afterwards, the co-pilot, Flight Lieutenant Rich Ross, was reminded that it was his birthday with a cake. He's 26.
Happy birthday, then.
Oh, then.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear
No, I didn't plan to be here, but such is life. That's all right. Makes a change having a birthday on an aircraft, isn't it? So no doubt we'll get some time off one night and really celebrate it.
You've got a fine cake here. Were you expecting it?
No, it was sent out by my mother a few days ago. It's about the first parcel I had from her, but she decided I wasn't going to be at home for this birthday, so she sent it out to me here.
Where would you rather be?
Probably in a pub back in Scotland with my mates getting a bit drunk by now, but such is life, it's what I get paid for, and we'll all have a good time later on, no doubt.
Ah, good to hear an honest man. That was our reporter Phil Jones with a Nimrod. Earlier this morning, General Sir Anthony Farrow-Hockley, former Commander-in-Chief of the Allied forces in Northern Europe, surprised some of us, I think, a bit with his optimism, bullishness, whatever. He said that the war would be over, he thought, within a matter of days, not weeks. Quite specific, a few days. Chris Lee, what did you make of that?
Well, I think what General Farrow-Hockley meant was this, is that if the main crunch of the fighting has not been completed, let's say within about 7 or 8 days, maybe 10 days from now, then there's something terrible would have happened. There's trouble somewhere. And he believes, therefore, that the main part of the fighting could be over in very few days, but then you'll probably get a couple of weeks of hard slogging just to finish off the whole campaign, by which time he thinks then the war would be officially over. But it won't mean that people have gone home and that the battlefield is quiet.
But the war will have been won.
The war will have been won on Western terms.
Chris Lee, thank you. This has been Radio 4 News FM. I'm John Humphreys. We shall be rejoining you after 2.
This is...
The Director of Public Prosecutions has said he will no longer argue that the Birmingham Six's convictions are still safe and satisfactory. Labour's Home Affairs spokesman Roy Hattersley tells us he believes the men should be freed immediately. Police are investigating an explosion on the railway line from St Albans in Hertfordshire into London. The latest trade figures show a current account deficit of over £1 billion, worse than expected. The land campaign to liberate Kuwait is still proceeding as planned, according to Allied military sources in the Gulf. The latest coalition successes include a report that French troops have captured a further 1,800 Iraqi prisoners in their drive north into Iraq. There have been reports that tanks belonging to Iraq's highly trained Republican Guard are now on the move to confront the Allies, but there's confusion over their whereabouts. Our defence correspondent Mark Latey is in Riyadh.
The Allies say the ground offensive is still going well, with little serious opposition and large numbers of Iraqi prisoners being taken. The Allied offensive seems to be focused in 2 areas. Well to the west of Kuwait, Allied armoured and mechanised divisions are advancing rapidly north to cut off Iraq's army in the Kuwait area. At the same time, US helicopter-borne assault forces were dropped deep into Iraq to cut supply lines and perhaps also block the retreat of any Iraqi forces. They've been supported by a French light armoured division, while Britain's 1st Armoured Division is part of the main thrust. In Kuwait itself, the Marines have advanced from the border to west of Kuwait City, while other US forces, including paratroopers, seem to be on the outskirts of the capital. Arab forces have also broken through the fortified belt on the southern Kuwait border to move towards Kuwait City. So far, there's no details of a coherent Iraqi response. There are pilot reports of significant numbers of Republican Guard tanks on the move south last night, although their location is unclear and is probably north of Kuwait.
Iraqi land forces have launched a missile attack on Allied ships in the Gulf. The British destroyer HMS Gloucester detected the incoming Silkworm on its radar and intercepted it with its own Sea Dart missiles. Michael Nicholson from the British News Pool is on board HMS Gloucester.
In what could be a final desperate attempt to sink a British warship, the Iraqis fired a Silkworm missile at this destroyer early this morning. The radar-guided missile, which weighed 3 tons, that's 3 times bigger than an Exocet, was launched from the coast just over our horizon a little before daybreak. Gloucester was at that moment acting as shotgun to the U.S. battleship Missouri, that is, protecting it from air and missile attack, while the American warship's 16-inch guns continued to bombard remaining Iraqi installations off Kuwait City. Within 7 seconds of sighting the Silkworm on Gloucester's radar, 2 Sea Dart missiles were fired, and they intercepted it when the Silkworm was less than 30 seconds away. The explosion was clearly seen by those on deck. Having showed itself, we can assume that Allied aircraft have now attacked and destroyed the Silkworm launch site, as well as the ground troops operating it. And I can report once again that all British and American ships in our battle group are safe and well.
The latest military communique from Iraq claims that soldiers from its 3rd Army Corps have inflicted a heavy defeat on Allied forces in Kuwait and have launched a counter-offensive. It said that American, Egyptian and Saudi troops were involved in fierce battles around Iraqi positions. This report from Baghdad by our Middle East correspondent Tim Llewellyn has been compiled under Iraqi restrictions.
The Iraqi military communique said there had been fighting of legendary proportions, with the Iraqi army repelling an Allied armoured attack, fighting off an airborne landing inside Iraqi lines, killing men and destroying equipment, and actually launching a counter-offensive. The Iraqis said the 3rd Army, which is known to be in Kuwait itself, and is one of Iraq's most experienced and best trained units, had engaged the enemy, the Allies in our parlance, for 8 hours. It had expelled all Allied forces from territory they had occupied, the Iraqis said. Allied troops had been seen running away, leaving behind burning vehicles and equipment, fleeing in disgrace, as the Iraqis put it. Iraq finished its communique by saying that the fight had been settled in the 3rd Army's favour at 0900 local time. That's 6 in the morning, Greenwich Mean Time. There have been no direct references here to attacks inside Iraq itself or to Allied reports that thousands of Iraqi troops have been captured. But the official newspaper Al Thawra, The Revolution, which speaks for the ruling Ba'ath Party, said in a front-page editorial today that God's indignation, as it put it, would be on those soldiers who fled the battle, and hell would be their destiny.
The Saudi military authorities report that a column containing Saudi, Kuwaiti, Egyptian and Syrian forces has crossed into Kuwait and is advancing on Kuwait City. One of our correspondents, Jonathan Birchall, is with an Egyptian mechanised unit as it moves across the desert.
It's mid-morning here on a grey, overcast day. We're just inside the Saudi lines at the moment in a line of Egyptian infantry, mechanised infantry and armoured personnel carriers, which are snaking towards the sand berm which marks the Allied front line here. Across on the plain to the right, we see at least 2 more columns heading in towards Kuwait. Yesterday, this plain was covered with a mass of Egyptian armour and guns, waiting for the word to move in. They've now clearly done so, and they're now heading towards Kuwait. This column has now started moving through the berms. On both sides of us, the column to the left is going through, the armoured personnel carriers, and the truck is now going through as well. The truck going past, pulling an anti-tank weapon. We're now passing through the berm into the no man's land, and on each side of us the columns are moving forward. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 armoured personnel carriers ahead of us. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the left, and over on the right there's a convoy of trucks also moving through.
The Foreign Secretary Douglas Hurd has told the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee not to expect an early end to the war. A similar warning was given to the War Cabinet when it met to consider latest developments. Our chief political correspondent, John Harrison, reports from Westminster.
The Foreign Secretary, who described Saddam Hussein as bogus, a puffed-up frog of a man, was clearly eager to counter any risk of Allied euphoria following successes in the early stages of the Gulf Offensive. Mr. Hurd told MPs, "I would counsel the committee against supposing that the war is going to be over very quickly." Earlier, the Chief of the Defence Staff, Sir David Craig, told the War Cabinet that Allied forces were progressing well, better than expected. But he too warned against over-optimism. These were early days, and significant forces, the Iraqi Republican Guard, still had to be confronted and overcome. The Defence Secretary, Tom King, in a Commons statement this afternoon, is expected to update MPs on Allied casualties and the number of Iraqis taken as prisoners. Downing Street officials estimate well in excess of 10,000. Before this morning's meeting, the Prime Minister spent 20 minutes on the phone to Chancellor Kohl. They discussed reports of Iraqi atrocities in Kuwait, which, according to Whitehall, are so gruesome that officials are eager to secure verification. Mr. Major and Chancellor Kohl agreed that, following the failure of the Soviet-Iraqi peace proposals, Moscow did want to sustain friendly relations with the rest. As for Moscow's peace plan, Douglas Hurd has just said that the ceasefire proposals demanded a trust in Saddam Hussein which just couldn't be justified.
President Bush is being continuously briefed on the progress of the war. He's said to be pleased with the speed of the operation, but officials in the United States have also moved to dampen any premature euphoria. They say there could be some fierce fighting before Kuwait is liberated. Here's one of our correspondents in Washington, Diana Goodman.
Although the initial news blackout announced by the Pentagon has been relaxed enough to allow some television film of the ground offensive to be broadcast here, none of it so far has shown the Allied troops engaged in close combat. That fact, coupled with the upbeat official assessments given about the first day of the fighting, has led to a surge in public confidence that the war may soon be over. But officials are now moving to reduce those expectations, stressing that the Allies have not yet taken on the Republican Guard and that the U.S. forces could still suffer heavy casualties. The White House spokesman, Marlon Fitzwater, said that although President Bush was proud of the way the operation was going, he still had the anxiety that went with war. Right through the conflict in the Gulf, the Bush administration has been trying to strike a careful balance in maintaining public confidence that U.S. military might will prevail, while at the same time preparing the American people for any increase in the number of dead and wounded. The note of caution being introduced indicates that the White House believes the scales may be tipping too far on the side of confidence, and the message now going out is that the war is not yet won.
Diana Goodman, and we'll have more analysis of events in the Gulf later in the programme, but now for the rest of today's news, here's Peter.
To come up from and be rooted in the region. So there will be an interplay, and it'll be very complicated, and I would hate the committee or anybody to feel that this is going to be easy.
Douglas Hurd, and one member of the Foreign Affairs Committee listening to him is the Conservative MP Ivan Lawrence, who's on the line now. Mr. Lawrence, were you satisfied by Mr. Hurd's answers?
Well, there wasn't very much more that Douglas Hurd could say. He spoke about the three situations. One, the present war now. He said the war aims remain the same, that Iraq should withdraw from Kuwait, restore the Kuwaiti legitimate government, and that there should be peace and security. He spoke about the immediate post-war and wouldn't be drawn on what kind of arrangement anybody may be talking about now. He merely said that it was not likely that we would have to face that problem immediately and that we should discourage feelings that the war will be over the day after tomorrow or anything like that. He said it would be difficult and in fact foolish to start sort of speculating too much about the immediate post-war. As for the third, the beyond the immediate post-war, he said, well, there will have to be permanent arrangements for the Middle East, but the British didn't have a blueprint. All we did was set out a list of matters which had to be considered. The Gulf states were meeting now to see what they could do, and he said that it wouldn't really, in his view, be a place for some enormous great legal peace conference which covers the world, because there were too many very important vital matters to be considering, like Gulf security, the Arab-Israeli problem, how to get rid of the weapons of mass destruction, the Maghreb, the Iran-Iraq situation, the Syrian-Lebanon situation, and that therefore we should try to discount the possibility of some enormous international peace conference which would deal with all of those matters.
Well, rather than trying to tackle them all ourselves now, let's consider more particularly and more immediately the immediate post-war period, because there is a big political question, isn't there, about A, how we know when the war is won, B, what we do if the Iraqi forces were to withdraw just beyond the boundaries of Kuwait. We've talked about it before, but this is coming very close to a need for a political decision. Perhaps you'd have been happier if he'd given you more indication as to his thinking.
Well, I did ask him, I did press him about it, but I must say that he having said that he wouldn't be drawn on it and couldn't be drawn on it, I did think that was not an unreasonable response, even though I did want the answer. Because obviously if the war is going to be over in a few days' time, then something is going to have to happen very quickly to fill the vacuum, and there's no immediate likelihood that somebody's going to step into, that we know about, that somebody's going to step into Saddam Hussein's shoes. There isn't a Rafsanjani to take over from Ayatollah Khamenei.
In the absence of that, shouldn't we have a plan, and shouldn't we, as those who have sent the troops to war, have a right to know about what the plan is?
Well, I mean, I can only gather from that there is actually no immediate plan, and that the war will take a few weeks, during which, of course, the United Nations and the coalition powers will be getting together to see exactly what they should do in one of a number of scenarios. Of course, it does very much depend upon how the war ends, whether it ends because Saddam Hussein throws up his hand and withdraws, or whether it ends because we've beaten them and they surrender. Where it ends, I mean, we're going to have to put an end to his capability of coming back and doing the same thing again in a few weeks, months, or even years' time. So that does mean putting out of action his military machine, and where that will take place and how the matter will end is rather difficult to foresee at this stage.
Ivan Lawrence, thank you very much. The Soviet Union, which expressed its official regret at the start of the land offensive, has for the most part kept its counsel for the past 36 hours. But the pressure on Mr. Gorbachev from conservative forces within the country was demonstrated perhaps.
His own people, his own nation can deal with him. I'm talking about the people in the city of Kuwait. I'm talking about the people who are murdering children, and they are doing horrible things right now.
We had reports of tanks moving south, Iraqi tanks.
Well, I can tell you one thing, there's lots of maneuvers over there.
Your Royal Highness, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you and all the Allied forces on the success so far achieved. I have two questions. You're welcome. Which troops moved in first in the KTO? And my second question,
Sorry,
which troops moved in first in the Kuwaiti theater of operation? And my second question, you just warned the war criminals. Can you give us some examples of the war crimes that the Iraqi regime has been committing?
Well, to answer your first question, they all moved, whether it's in the same time or there's certain timing between them, I cannot elaborate on that. But they all moved, and they are all inside Kuwait. For your other question, examples, there is horrible things going on. I hate to say it, but there is killing people by axes, hitting both heads. They rape females, cut them, certain parts of them, and hang them in every street. There is, unfortunately, they even try to force their own Iraqi very young soldiers to kill another Kuwaiti children, those type of things, which is, if I elaborate on it, it's so horrible.
Is it still going on right now?
We hope to stop it so soon.
You talked about Allied casualties. What can you tell us now about Iraqi casualties in terms of, as a result of ground fighting, or what you may now have learned happened as a result of the air campaign?
Well, I don't have precise numbers, but there is, I'm sure there's lots of casualties there, but I cannot really give you specific numbers because I just don't have it right now.
Well, I know you can't tell us how long you expect it to last, but would it be wrong for us then to assume that it will be a short campaign given the success that you're reporting to us today?
One of our planning that we hope it will be short, decisive, and swift.
Resistance on the part of the Iraqis was very light. How would you describe the resistance today?
Well, as you know, when you enter the first day, element of surprise has tremendous effort to make less resistance. Now we are talking about other more better trained forces, but we, as I said before, we have to plan for the worst. I believe that we might have more resistance today and tomorrow, but this is all planned for.
Many soldiers are quoted as saying that they are surprised by the limited amount of resistance they have run into so far. Could you, speaking only about what's happened so far, not telling us about plans in the future, say whether that's because the Allies have been moving around pockets of resistance or simply because the Iraqi military has been overrated? It really wasn't as much of a threat, military threat, as it was originally thought.
I think all what you said, you can say it's right, because but there's one main element that, you know, we can see the number, based on the numbers of prisoners of war, that they really don't believe in their fight. I'm not underestimating the Iraqi soldiers' ability and professionalism in fighting. As a matter of fact, they are good, but there's one thing they are lacking, which they don't believe in what they are fighting for right now.
This tremendous number of EPWs that are being picked up are actually complicating the situation in the rear, that just moving so many people back out of Kuwait and into Saudi Arabian camps is a problem. Could you comment on that? And could you also explain to us the facilities that you have and how many potential prisoners you're ready to cope with?
I did not see any problems of bringing back prisoners. I didn't hear about it, and if I don't hear about it, it means that it's doing fine. How many prisoners we can accommodate? There's lots of prisoners. I estimated before that it will be over 100,000. That's why we are prepared for more than 100,000 prisoners of war.
General, I know you can't give us an exact figure, but could you perhaps give us an estimate as to how much Kuwaiti territory has been retaken at this point? About 10% or half, or whatever you could estimate?
Enough to make our plan successful now.
General, could you tell us whether you have any plans to deal with Saddam Hussein personally after the war? You say it's being left to the Iraqi people. Does that mean that categorically, if he survives this, he will not be tried as a war criminal?
We have no plan except freeing Kuwait, and for Saddam, that's up to the world and his people.
General, expect the Allied forces, did they expect to have 20,000 POWs in the first 2 days?
I expect everything, and I plan for everything.
General, has there been any more indications of any chemical weapons?
No, until now we don't have any evidence of chemical use. Nothing will surprise me.
Chemical mines?
General, is the biggest fight with the Iraqis lie outside of Kuwait?
Sorry, would you repeat again?
Does the biggest fight with the Iraqis lie outside of Kuwait? That is, the strongest forces that Iraq has is outside of Kuwait. And
I cannot comment except that we treat the theater of operation that anywhere that there is forces, enemy forces, we can deal with.
Let me restate that. Is the strongest Iraqi force outside of Kuwait?
There is some strong points outside the Kuwaiti border and inside the Iraqi border.
General, of the 20 so EPWs or prisoners of war that have been taken so far, are these almost exclusively those lesser quality troops along the border, or are some of them from the mobile reserve as well of the Iraqi army?
I don't think I can judge that right now.
General, can you say whether you said that you might meet more resistance or better troops today and tomorrow? Can you say whether up to now your advance has been slower on the second day than on the first?
No, our advance, our conduct of battles is going exactly according to plan.
No, not slower today?
Just according to plan.
General, when I look at your smiley face as a Kuwaiti, it's make me feel very optimistic. Do you have any particular statement to Kuwaiti people?
We will be there soon, very soon.
Thank you.
General, if I could restate an earlier question, how much of a fight do you expect the Republican Guard will put up once they meet Allied troops?
I hope they will surrender, but they will, if they fight that, we are prepared for it.
Well, for example, much has been made in the initial days of the bombing campaign that the Republican Guard were very heavily struck by Allied bombers. How much have they been attrited in the early days of the campaign?
Well, I cannot answer that. Let's wait and see.
General, regarding the atrocities in Kuwait, can you tell us, give us some idea of the scale of this? Tell us whether it's just one unit of the Iraqi army or widespread amongst the Iraqi army, and also the war crimes trials you're talking about afterwards. Will those be conducted according to Islamic law?
You mean the criminal war?
Yes.
As I said before, that it's up to the international law, and we will just announce them as criminal war, and then it will be above my echelon how to be treated.
What about the scale of the atrocities, General? The scale of the atrocities in Kuwait? Of the atrocities, the murdering, how many?
How many people?
Are we talking about? Are we talking about thousands of people being murdered and raped?
In Kuwait, you mean? The only report I heard is a few hundred, but I really cannot pinpoint the number. Two more questions.
Can you tell us, sir, is there combat going on now inside of Kuwait City?
There are combat going everywhere in the theater of operation.
Last question, please. That does include Kuwait City, then, is that right, sir?
Everywhere, sir.
Ground combat in Kuwait City, is that right?
Ground combat in Kuwait City.
There is battle everywhere, whether it's from friendly forces or from resistance. Thank you very much.
Will Kuwait City be liberated today,
Thank you.
General?
Thank you.
Today?
And that was Lieutenant General Prince Khaled bin Sultan, who's the Joint Forces Commander in Saudi Arabia, at his military press briefing a little earlier today. I must explain that those curious noises that you heard nothing to do with this studio here at the BBC, but were problems, in fact, with the microphone as it was being passed from hand to hand among the correspondents before they actually put their questions to General bin Sultan. Well, with me, Paul Reynolds and Chris Lee. Chris, can I come to you first of all? Some of the military points that emerged from that, because I think, Paul, as you were just suggesting to me, of course, this whole war crimes issue is an interesting one too. But let's take, first of all, the military points as you saw them emerging there, Chris.
Just an important point. When he was talking about casualties, he said they were remarkably light, and that the coalition forces, the Allies, he said, had lost 5 killed and 20 wounded. In fact, I think General Khaled made a slight mistake there. What he was really saying was, or should have been saying, was that there are 5 Saudis have been killed and 20 wounded in action, and so the coalition figure is, although he says the casualties are remarkably light, would be expected to be higher than that. And that, I think, it was particularly important. It was also interesting. He said that he was asked, "Well, is there fighting in Kuwait?" And he said, there's a battle going on everywhere. And then he was pressed on this. He said, does that mean there was fighting in Kuwait? And he said, there's battle going on everywhere, with a big smile on his face. And so one, I suppose, could, with some caution, assume that what he was trying to say was that, yes, there are some elements within Kuwait City itself. And he was also asked, when will Kuwait City be relieved by a Kuwaiti, and he said we'll be there very soon. But I think that really, apart from the complications which he could see with prisoners of war, he said that they had started the war expecting 100,000 prisoners, and so far there are 20,000 who've gone in. And it is a difficulty. I mean, what do you do with them when they come in at such a rate? It's not the quantity, it's the rate at which they're coming in. And then he got on, he was pressed quite a lot on something which I think Paul will be talking about, and that is the war crimes. Reports which have not been substantiated, the reports which tend to come in from one source. He was talking about people being killed by axes, rape, people being cut and then hanged. And that young Iraqi soldiers were being forced to kill Kuwaiti children. I'm not clear the origin of these reports, and I'm not clear that I understand yet that the coalition forces have made it clear where their sources come from. And one suspects they're all from the same source, but I really don't know.
One can't help feeling that some people might argue, with a certain political point of view, that it was very conveniently timed, these atrocities, or is that being overly cynical?
Well, I think